On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, a reprieve on new U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods. But markets spooked by a harbinger of recession, darker clouds ahead, and e-commerce competition heats up. With double-digit global growth seen, good times for online shoppers? Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live on CGTN from Beijing. We begin with the latest on the trade spat between China and the U.S. on Tuesday. President Trump from the U.S. announced a new 10% tariff on $300 billion worth of Chinese goods, set to take effect on September the 1st, will be delayed until December the 15th. On Thursday, the Chinese Ministry of Finance says these new tariffs violate the consensus reached by the leaders of the two countries in Osaka at the end of July during the G20 summit, and China will take necessary countermeasures. Meanwhile, economies around the world are sounding the alarm over the specter of a recession, sending shares on a free fall on Wednesday, and likely to continue later this week. Before we get discussion with our panelists, take a look at this first.
Wall Street suffered its biggest drop in 2019 on Wednesday.
The Dow dropping more than 800 points.
Shares took a beating after the yield on the 10-year U.S. Treasury note briefly dipped below the yield on the 2-year one. In the past, whenever that abnormal inversion occurred, a recession followed. Economists repeated a warning that a protracted battle over tariffs between the world's two largest economies will slow down global growth, and the numbers are indeed discouraging. Germany reported its economy shrank 0.1% last quarter, no thanks to the trade war, according to analysts. Latest data from China showed the economy was on an even keel but faced downward pressure. In the U.S., Mr. Trump has taken a step back on his tariffs due next month.
For the first time, President Trump says American consumers, not China, could pay a price for his ongoing trade war. The
administration delayed a 10% tariff on about $300 billion of Chinese goods to December 15th.
The items include cell phones, laptops, video game consoles, some toys, and clothing. Some products got taken off the new tariff list completely: car seats, Bibles, and other religious literature. While U.S. companies have long pleaded with the White House to stop the tit-for-tat tariff escalation, citing harm to consumers and their businesses, Mr. Trump has been undeterred. The delay in tariffs was announced following a telephone conversation between top Chinese officials and U.S. trade reps early Tuesday. Trump said the conversation was very productive, and the two sides agreed to talk again in 2 weeks. As the U.S. president counts on the economy to give him a second term in the White House, is the cost of the trade war hitting too close to home?
For the latest discussion on China-U.S. trade war, as some say, joining us in Washington, D.C., James Moore, the founder and CEO of Washington Institute for Business, Government and Society. Also in Washington, D.C., Professor Arthur Dong from Georgetown University's McDonald School of Business. Last but not least, in Beijing studio, Xu Sitao, Chief Economist from Deloitte, China. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Go to Professor Dong first. What do you make of the latest decision made by the White House of the so-called delay of certain items which were originally earlier put on 10% tariff, 300 billion Chinese yuan products to the United States? What do you make of the latest?
Yes, Tian, it signals from the White House that the White House is stepping back from the the actions that the President Trump had imposed on China starting September 1st. Oftentimes what we see is impulsive action on the part of President Trump, and later a sort of part of his modus operandi, his ministers and his advisors walking him back from the brink. And so we see a step back from the brink, and because there's a realization on the part of President Trump that the repercussions and the impact of the additional tariffs are going to hit the American consumer extremely hard, particularly sensitive as we run up to the buying Christmas season.
On the other hand, we see almost at the same time the stock market has been going down dramatically, and the predictions about the economy, including that of the United States, even though it was earlier much more optimistic, Mr. Moore, now seems to be also going through a vein of uncertainty. Mr. Moore, how much do you think when the White House was making the decision to delay actually know and could have a sense of what's to come about the economy and certainly about the mentality?
Well, I think it's important to realize the president, of course, has access to extraordinarily important information before the rest of us get it, and was undoubtedly shown that if we entered into this tariff tit-for-tat with China, that there were going to be some serious consequences, particularly going into 2020, the election year. But I think it's important to recognize that tariffs are only one part of a bigger equation. The news coming out of Germany, out of course, China, but elsewhere around the world has shown that this island of stability that seemingly in the United States economically is beginning to be hit fairly hard. And so there's no question that ultimately the United States is going to reach a point that enters into a recession. The question is, when will it come and how deep will it be?
But on the other hand, Mr. Xu, we see that the U.S. government has earlier decided to put on more Chinese companies onto the so-called entity list by the Commerce Department. Now, just a reference to our audience, entity list was also among, some of the other names, for example, Huawei as well. So what does that mean? It seems that there's always mixed signals coming out of the White House so far.
Well, I think that's a great question, because I think if both parties will reach a deal, I still think both parties will reach a deal this year. And I think one of the necessary conditions for the U.S. is to remove some of these Chinese companies off entity list, because you really cannot combine the issue of national security and with trade. And if it's really just national security, and you cannot negotiate.
Right.
And so I think that's a very important step for the U.S. to be taking if we have a trade deal before end of this year.
There's two things, Professor Dong, given your knowledge and our earlier sophisticated discussion. One is that the White House current right now is trying to equal national security issues to trade issues without giving evidence about any kinds of accusations concerning national security. That's one thing about the tactic. The other tactic is there's always mixed picture, and there's two steps backwards, one step forward, and it takes on at different timetables. So Professor Dong, how much of it is tactic? But on the other hand, even if it is tactic, as you may identify, what would that mean about the general atmosphere of the negotiation?
Yes, certainly. This is a procedural issue here. The fact that President Trump in the White House has been referring to or utilizing Section 301, using tariffs, being able to implement tariffs unilaterally and quickly as a result of Section 301 by aligning security interests or accusations that national security is imperiled as a result of various activities between the United States and China. And so it's been very convenient for the White House to utilize this particular section because it offers great speed and economy with regard to the imposition of tariffs. Now, what's looming is the most recent announcement by the White House declaring officially that China is a currency manipulator, opening the pathway, as I think what Mr. Xu had been referring to, for Commerce Department to additionally add more companies onto the banned trade list. And that is sort of one of the consequences that is going to amplify the current trade debate.
Not only that, but also political topics as well, as we have seen some tweets coming from the president later yesterday suggesting about some internal issues regarding China's politics was also mentioned in a tweet regarding the trade negotiation. So, Mr. Xu, how dangerous and how likely China is going to kowtowing to threats like this when it comes to trade negotiations?
Okay, I think after 12-round negotiation, right, I think both parties have become more realistic. And as I said earlier, I still see a trade deal toward the end of the year. And one of the reasons for me to hold a relatively sanguine view is I think discussion will be relatively narrow. It's not going to be all over the place. I would like to make another comment on national security, right? This is something which you may take that very offensively. But U.S. is not just doing that to China. I've seen some of the similar treatment between U.S. and even with U.S. allies like New Zealand.
Trading partners.
So probably we don't want to take that too seriously. Same goes for currency manipulator. IMF already reject that notion, and I don't think we should take that too seriously.
Very interesting what you have just said, that not to take it so seriously. That's really leading up to the next question. Mr. Moore, how do you see all of these dramas, twists and turns regarded as so-called tactics out of Washington, or so-called mixed messages, lack of coordination out of the White House? But how much really of it is a tactic to use various tools all at the same time to be useful against China and let China to make concessions? What do you make of that?
Well, first of all, I think it's very important to put in perspective the U.S.-China trading relationship over a number of years. I served in the Reagan administration and was one of the first individuals to host a trade delegation from the People's Republic of China. In those days, this was 1985, the Chinese were selling $4 billion worth of goods to the United States. The United States was selling $4 billion worth of goods to China. In fact, the United States had a few $1 million trade surplus. As of this year, at the end of June, for the first 6 months, the United States sold $52 billion worth of goods to China. China sold to the United States $220 billion worth of goods. And so I think one of the problems has been that President Trump has watched over a long period of time, as we all have, certain issues that have cropped up that really have not been dealt with, either on the part of the United States or by China. And so the can has just been kicked down the road. So when President Trump came into office, he decided that he was going to keep to his campaign promises, namely to be able to take on these issues that had been festering for so very, very long. And so now we're in a position where we're going into an election year, 2020. The president is having to balance the combination of what he promised the American people the first go around with his election, and trying to deal with, obviously, the concerns of keeping not only the U.S.-China trading relationship afloat, but also to make sure that this does not cause serious global problems.
Interesting when you're saying it is not causing serious global problems. It is already causing serious global problems. It really depends on seriousness in your interpretation. But if you look at the markets over the past few days, not only here in Asia, but also all over the world, if you look at the trade practices these days, one country can put on unilateral sanctions against the other economy. It's not just between China and the United States now, it's between many of the top economies these days you see on the world's list. So it really depends on what you consider as seriousness in your description,
Absolutely.
sir. Yeah. So, but let me ask you also, Professor Dong, about that. The twists and turns, how much shall we, taking it into account, how much should we just brush it off and see more about what should be the light at the end of the tunnel, Professor Dong?
Yes, the interconnectedness of the global economy was certainly made clear yesterday. The Dow Jones Industrial Average had its biggest single-day drop of 800 points. So there was a virtual bloodbath in financial markets around the world that rippled around the world. And what was more alarming was the fact that what spooked markets was that we have an inverted yield curve. And it's one of the most reliable predictors of an oncoming recession. It has certainly proven to be a valid measure, certainly in the last 40 years. Whenever there's a yield curve reversion or inversion, what we're going to see shortly thereafter is a recession. So the implications and impact in terms of the amount of pain that's going to be sort of expressed by economies all over the world. Certainly a part of this has been inspired by the ongoing trade war between the United States and China. As markets close, trade withers, and recessionary fears are about to magnify.
Mr. Xu, Now, nobody wants the United States to have a recession. After all, it is the biggest economy in the world. If it is having a problem, everybody is going to have a problem to a certain extent. But the issue is that the U.S. and others are not driving themselves into a recession. That's the thing, at least we can do to avoid further repercussions of what's going on. So, to your knowledge, Mr. Xu, various interest groups in the business community, even though they want to see a successful result of the U.S. trying to balance its trade deficit with China, on the other hand, they also want to see predictability and certainty to a certain degree in the business, bilateral or multilateral. So how do you see the level of participation and support now they still have for the current White House, be it tactic or strategic?
Well, I would say both, right? First of all, as you know, there's a Chinese saying, if you don't have a fight, you may not forge genuine friendship. So maybe that's what it takes for U.S.-China just to bat it out and then to reach some, whether you call that truce or ceasefire. I think actually that may not be a bad outcome. Secondly, if you look at the financial market from last November midterm election, actually for a very long time the market was getting quite immune to trade-related news flows. So implicitly, market was taking a view there will be a deal. So maybe the
but that was during the earlier days. Now
so maybe the recent
pullback
pullback and the correction.
Particularly since the so-called naming China as the currency manipulator, we see people are getting much more vulnerable toward that specific act.
So the market actually in past few days actually perversely may give the Trump administration more incentive to strike a deal with China. I mean, in the end, if you have a deal, it's better to do that in 2019, not in 2020. You know, during the election, you are not going to get much utility out of that. And I think for China, I really don't want to say concessions, all this, because a lot of things, what U.S. is demanding probably is in line with China's reform agenda in the very super long run, you know, IPR, market access, so on and so forth. So China is going to do some of these things anyway.
But it really depends under what circumstances. And China will do it on its own initiative rather than being forced into a corner in a trade negotiation as if it was being forced onto China. Those are two different things, as you may know. Mr. Moore, let me go to you as well. From now till the end of the year. Now, President Trump does have a say to its voters about whether to balance the trade with China or not, as he earlier promised. But he also has a good promise to his voters that the U.S. economy will remain strong. So obviously one will sometime influence the other if the tactics are being used too much. Of course, if you're talking about decoupling of the two economies, it will be even worse. So, Mr. Moore, I would assume the White House will be quite nervous at this point as to how to walk this fine balance, even on its own political agenda.
Well, certainly the White House should be concerned, but we shouldn't forget the fact that the United States right now has record employment. The consumer spending remains healthy at the moment, but obviously there are these signs on the horizon that should be of concern. But we shouldn't take away the fact that there are some very positive things that have allowed this economy to be so strong over the course of 9 years, which in itself is a record.
Congratulations for that record, first of all. But secondly, go to you, Professor Dong, about that. Now, the Chinese economy is growing above 6%, even though there would be, as some economists suggest, some further slowing down of the Chinese economy. Both the market size and the sheer growth itself is still the most amazing in the world, despite of whatever the commentaries have been talking about in various media organizations. So in negotiations, two sides would threaten the other and saying, I'm the best and I'm strong. No problem about that, it's just tactic. But Professor Dong, how much do you think people should realistically understand the status of the economies, and now to let negotiation tones, in a way, become the real understanding of the economies from both sides?
Yeah, there is an old expression that you better be careful what you wish for because you may get it. China's ability to deal with the current downturn, China has at its disposal many tools. And what we're seeing remarkably around the world, a great deal of resilience amongst major economies when it comes to dealing with shocks. And the reason being is that the skill level and the competencies of economic ministers and government advisors has increased all over the world, and China certainly being no exception. And so much has been said about China's, certainly President Trump is making a great deal of talk with regard to the decline of the Chinese economy and the overall impact of the trade war. And certainly empirical evidence certainly does suggest that there has been a slowing down, certainly with regard to the tradable goods and manufacturing sector. But when you consider the fact that it's one of the world's largest consumer economies, and as China, as Mr. Xu has suggested, sort of reevaluates and restructures the composition of their GDP, placing greater emphasis on consumption, well, once those billions of Chinese consumers begin to spend more, that can certainly be enough to sort of right the ship in the face of growing tariff barriers around the world. And so in order to sustain itself, I think China has many more tools at its disposal, but we will be realistic, and I will agree with Jim that that China is certainly facing some headwinds in the immediate moment.
Yeah. Before we go, we have only a minute and 30 seconds left. Every one of you, can you help us to understand, could there be a deal or not by the end of this year before the election season is coming in the United States? And briefly, why or why not? Mr. Moore, you want to go first, sir?
I think there will be a deal, but the notion that that's going to be some kind of a permanent solution to our problems, I think, would be greatly exaggerated. I think it'll be some kind of a decision that allows for the can to be kicked down the road.
I see. Professor Dong?
I would agree with Jim in stating that I think there's some momentum behind the current U.S.-China trade debate that may require longer-term restructuring of this relationship moving down the road. But I do believe that politics are going to become a central focus as to whether or not the acceleration of a trade agreement will either happen or not happen.
I see. Last but not least, Mr. Xu.
Yes, I see a deal.
By the
whether
end of the year?
it's in October or November, the reason is that if it's a deal next year, it's going to be not much meaningful for President Trump. For China, I think it's more than just a ceasefire. It's going to be some concrete changes in terms of IPR protection and market access.
Thank you so much, the three of you gentlemen, for joining us. Xu Sitao, James Moore, and Arthur Dong. Really appreciate it. Thank you. And you're watching World Insight. The program is coming to you live from Beijing. Further onto our program, e-commerce competition heats up with double-digit global growth seen. Good times for online shoppers. Well, we will get you up to speed right after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN. Global e-commerce has grown by leaps and bounds in recent years. More people prefer to shop online than to go to a store. No wonder competition is heating up. Sales have reached an amazing amount in some developed countries and emerging economies, but there are also some regions left behind. How is e-commerce in your hometown? Here are some answers my producer found out from some of our friends from different parts of the world.
Now, I was born in America, so I'm talking from a Chinese-American point of view. So when I was in the States, I used eBay. I didn't really use Amazon just because I don't want to make Jeff Bezos richer. I did use eBay, and I had quite a good experience from it. I think maybe packages come within maybe about 2 days, and I will have to pay using just my credit card, which, I mean, back then I thought was normal, but now I use Taobao in China. I think it's much more seamless, and I think it just made me a lot lazier. I don't really have a purpose to go anywhere anymore.
Online shopping back home in the Philippines is slowly catching on. A lot of people actually log in now for a lot of things, from electronic gadgets to fashion to household items like cleaners and stuff. So before coming here to China, I got my last phone on Lazada, which is like the biggest online platform, I think, in our part of the world, in Southeast Asia. It's especially strong in neighboring countries like Singapore and Malaysia.
Basically, in Liberia, we don't have a real professional online platform for purchasing and sales of items. What people and organizations and businesses normally do is that they make use of available social media platforms, putting the items on Facebook, on Instagram, or whatever, and then people make order. But when I came to China, I realized there is a lot that you can do on the internet. I just did a click in search for the jersey, the kind of jersey that I wanted to buy. In less than 48 hours, it was delivered to my doorstep.
Having heard from the consumers, let's discuss how is the global e-commerce competition shaping up in New York. Max Wolf, professor of economics from New School University. Welcome, sir. In Shanghai, Shen Yi, a researcher at the Center for Communication and State Governance Research in Fudan University. And in Beijing, Andy Mock, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. I want to go to you first, Professor Wolf. What do you make of the various levels of sophistication about e-commerce worldwide? Will that be a divide further?
Yeah, so thanks for having me. It's always great to be here. Look, I think there are kind of three broad groups globally by e-commerce. One is the group that's already deeply penetrated by and excited about e-commerce, where it's a large and growing portion of how things are bought. That group is parts of Europe, all of North America, and particularly Northeast Asia, where the e-commerce revolution is already a done deal. It's a question of how large and how much it grows and when there are setbacks, but it's very, very well established. And there's Sub-Saharan Africa and South America a bit, where there's been meaningful advance, and there are some categories where e-commerce is extremely successful, but the penetration is lower. But I would say, I would start the comment by saying that e-commerce is a fragile, complex supply chain most of the time. And because it's a fragile trust environment, if you break trust, if the rules and norms of globalization come under the kind of sustained attacks we've seen of late, it could mean that we move backwards or at least move forward more slowly. But it's certainly here to stay.
What about that, Mr. Shen? Two things it seems that Professor Wolf just mentioned. One is the divide already existing when it comes to e-commerce worldwide. Secondly, further complexity of geopolitics and lack of multilateral platform support would certainly have a dampening effect on the e-commerce future.
The lack of the confidence, especially when the rising the geopolitical difficulties or the potential risk of the rising conflicts among the main stakeholders in this e-commerce will raise big challenges. But the real pathetic point is, before that, say that the development of the e-commerce, they already find some rules they can finding how to build this trust in the framework of business. But the new rising geopolitical conflict rise more uncertainty and complex, and I think we need to control and manage it.
Now there are already, Mr. Mock, some of the international agreements taking place among at least the business community about what to do about e-commerce and what are some of the common standards and ethic issues. Will they be able to support the future development of the sector, of course?
Well, I'm more optimistic about this. I mean, from a standards perspective and from a development perspective. And here's why. We can look at the case of China. So China is unique in that such a large continental country that is underserved in the traditional retail sense, meaning we look at a market like the United States, like Western Europe. They've had decades, if not hundreds of years, to develop a complete retail supply chain in many brick-and-mortar retail stores. China has leapfrogged, especially in rural areas, by using e-commerce. So now, pretty much anywhere in China, you can buy a broad range of products. Similarly, Africa, India, other underserved markets, I think we'll see a similar phenomenon. And the standards, these globalization issues will be pulled along as a result of that. So I'm more optimistic.
Interesting. Professor Wolf, on the other hand, you see technologies have been changing so much, not only about e-commerce, but you see 5G has now become such a key word these days that it's likely to have a lot of impossible to imagine, even at this moment, the impact on the way that we are going to do with our business and life. So how much do you think new technologies are going to even quickly transform where e-commerce has already conquered?
Yeah, so I think what is going to be deliverable and the quality and speed of that delivery changes fast with 5G.
Professor Wolf, go ahead.
Yes, so I think 5G means we can get much more rapid, much more complete delivery of things that we couldn't get before, but it also means that we can pull into the e-commerce space things we couldn't before. So I think of, for instance, the driverless car and truck revolution that's coming. The biggest hindrances to that so far are insurance and regulations at the state and local level governing vehicles. But then the other one is that basically the cloud, the internet cloud, is not thick enough to support certain bandwidth activities. 5G means it will be, and so live streaming, rich content, driverless vehicles, real-time inventory, sensor fusion and control of manufacturing facilities, and food quality and drug standards become real. But I would caution one thing, which is the phones, the routers, the switches, the telecom equipment, and the payment companies, without which it's hard to imagine e-commerce, are actually pretty much global enterprises run by a few companies in a few countries. And even though we haven't had to think about it before, we need those countries and companies to be able to work across borders to deliver a real e-commerce solution, because e-commerce is born of and into a globalized world. And if that's threatened, I think some of the e-commerce is threatened as well.
We have problems with that, really. More and more problems with that, unfortunately. With the ongoing trade war, for example, between China and the United States, you see, Mr. Shen, international companies hesitating to operate and spread their operations even further, let's just say further into the Chinese market. And the Chinese consumers also have been hesitating about which platform to use, because now they see probably the world is going to be more divided and more decoupled as a result. As Professor Wolf beautifully illustrated, how much danger or challenge are we seeing right now, even when it comes to the use and the future of e-commerce?
In the future, so I think the e-commerce has three pillars: technologies, infrastructures, and the policy environment. The rising concern on this trade war providing a negative effect on these policy things. The development of these 5G things put positive elements on this technology aspect. From the consumer and the companies want to do business, making profits. The consumers want to buy in products and got more benefits. Generally speaking, I can optimistically say that those positive elements has more powerful in the long terms. But in the short terms, we need to regulate the difficulties produced by the rising, talking about is the trade war things. We need to make those policymakers more clear understanding, especially from the Washington side, so have that better understanding that the more benefits the consumers got from these trade activities represented by the future, like e-commerce, the more supportive, the more popular they will be. And in future, I think finally these, how to say, these activities, these e-commerce have their own powers to persuade all those people who want to stop it or to put a negative hand on it.
At the very beginning, it was lack of international coordinated treaties or standards. Now, geopolitics has even become such a blockade for e-commerce operators to further spread their operations and consumers to feel confident about it. Mr. Mark, what do you think about the near term particularly?
Well, I think in the near term, clearly, globally, there's a lot of uncertainty because of these geopolitical issues. But I think that being said, and of course, from a consumer perspective, some of the best-known consumer brands in the world are American. We can talk about Apple, Nike, etc. But I think one of the power of e-commerce is that it really kind of levels the playing field as well. So just as we see in China the development of these so-called Taobao villages that were off the grid in a sense, but because they could now go online, could establish viable businesses, viable ecosystems, that we're seeing also at the same time these geopolitical tensions, but also the rise of regional trade flows as well. And places like Africa that are now having the opportunity to sell products into China, South America as well. So I think the picture is mixed. Clearly, it would be a much better world if these uncertainties caused by geopolitics did not exist. But in this world we're in, I think there is still a silver lining that e-commerce is delivering.
But Professor Wolf, I beg to differ from Mr. Mark. The fact that, for example, Amazon has been limiting its scale of operation in China recently. Some of the Chinese e-commerce are certainly very aware of the efforts made by the current administration to put on some of the most important tech companies onto the so-called entity list of the Commerce Department, making all the businesses very much concerned about what's next. So how would any business, including e-commerce, be able to thrive under the current circumstances and also make technology and innovation to take the place as they should be?
Yes, so clearly e-commerce has had a good run, and part of what's been good for e-commerce has been warm relationships with international and the home or host state. So if you look at Amazon, the early days of Amazon were no doubt meaningfully helped by a suspension of tax duties on internet activity, which helped in a vital period early in the growth of Amazon and some other major e-commerce players as well. And you can see Amazon kind of has a challenge domestically, by the way, perhaps less well known by everyone, as well as internationally. So the presidential administration here in the U.S. has been a bit hostile to Amazon, the Democratic Party as well. We actually saw a Democratic Party candidate, Sanders, who also ran last time for the nomination of the Democratic Party, sort of fly off the handle and decide that the Washington Post, owned by the founder of Amazon, was critical of some of his policy ideas, or him as a candidate, in part because of his tax proposals for Jeff Bezos. So I mean, the large e-commerce companies have been, both domestically and internationally, a bit victims of their own success and market heft. As they become a major way that goods move around the world, they also get in the crossfire of various domestic and international issues. But I do think we're also seeing the rise of this notion of the national champion, and that's quite dangerous for the big American tech companies who have become the big American tech companies the world knows, not just Americans know, because they have ranged fairly freely across borders in producing goods, sourcing clients and customers, moving payments. And I do think they are children of a globalized world, and not so clear how well they prosper if they grow up into a more hostile, more nationalistic, kind of smaller economic environment.
Same would ask, I guess, the question to the Chinese e-commerce companies, which are becoming global influential companies as well. Mr. Shen, about that, how volatile are they become to what's happening in the world?
Generally speaking, in this developing world or in the world other than the United States, I have to frankly speaking that the spread of the development of these Chinese e-commerce is highly welcomed. They providing the facilitations not only to the trade but also to lots of infrastructures and financials and so on. Generally speaking, the e-commerce, also called the digitalization of traditional trade activities, becoming one of the most important driving force and boost the development of the economies all around the world. Not only benefits to the China side, but also benefits to all those countries and the regions participating in such kind of activities. So in the long term, we need to have enough confidence that in futures, the digital economies will become the most important driving force for the world, and all people will love this e-commerce finally, I think.
Should we look at it long term and always optimistic and happy about it? Mr. Mark, briefly?
Well, I think the genie is out of the bottle in that there is no turning back, that once people have experienced e-commerce, that the only way is forward. And in the short term, we are experiencing some challenging times. But again, I think in the long term, it is an optimistic picture.
I hope I could be as optimistic as the three of you, but for now I want to thank the three of you for participating in this round of discussion. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much, gentlemen. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine or go to our YouTube channel. Follow us Twitter, Facebook, Sina Weibo, you name it. I'm Tian Wei. For everyone on World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time. More insights across China, around the world. Good night.